If you've looked into software development or maybe the modding communities, let's say you're not really into code, but you've looked into modding, and you may have heard the term hard-coded, to where basically they're talking about maybe for old games, for example, they'll talk about frame rate being hard-coded or resolution being hard-coded or damage values for items and weapons being hard-coded. Now, if you're a programmer, you should know exactly what these means, but if you don't, and you're maybe an onlooker, don't worry, Michael here, welcoming you to Design View, and today we're going to be talking about what is hard-coded and soft-coded and what are the advantages and disadvantages of both. Now, today I'm going to be talking about programming, and I'm going to be specifically talking about variables, and this is mostly where this kind of goes into play because it's talking about variables and how they end up being used and how they can be modified by the program and external programs as well when you end up getting into soft programming. So if you don't know what programming is, it is essentially a language that you end up programming in, and then it ends up taking that, interpreting it, translating it, / compiling it into something that your computer can read. Now, the problem with this is the fact that kind of reversing this process is next to impossible. There are some low-level languages that things will run in, such as assembly, to where you can technically reverse engineer it, but for the most part, you can't redo it, which means that if you hard-code a value, which we'll talk about a little bit later, it means that you have to go back in and you have to do things like hex editing, you have to change the machine code, binary files, etc., to actually get things to run properly, which means that basically, if you hard-code a value, it cannot be changed without changing the source code, essentially, or the machine code, which is not something you technically want to do. However, if you end up using soft coding or the kind of mixture between both, you can end up making it so that, let's say, external functions within the program, you can end up patching it, or you can end up going into, let's say, external files, for example, where you have assets that store variables and etc., and you can end up using those to end up changing those variables instead. So if you end up, even if you end up kind of botching it within the code itself, you can end up, oh, it's just a variable, I'll just change it inside this asset file, and then it can be changed. Preferably, that's the way you want to program, but there are some advantages to hard coding. So let's go ahead and talk about all these. So we have hard coding, which is basically one of the forms. This is how a lot of beginners end up programming too. It's kind of a little bit difficult. I don't know why a lot of beginner programmers I talk to have problems with variables, but hard coding is essentially where you don't use variables. You get rid of variables and you just use solid functions. And so, for example, let's just do a solid function here. We end up having 10 minus 4 equals 6, right? And you always want it to equal 6, and you have this function for whatever. It's like, screen width type slight. And normally what you would do is you would get rid of this function part, and you would just be like, it's 6, right? It's 6, and it's always going to be 6. Let's say it's frame rate, for example. I'll use frame rate for the rest of this, so it'd be like 60 FPS, and that's what you're going to be going to. I love talking about frame rate. But you end up having hard-coded. Generally, you don't want to do this. It does have some performance advantages. For example, you're not using a lot of variables, etc., etc. We'll talk about it a little bit later. But then there's the opposite, which is soft coding. Now, soft coding is essentially making everything a variable. And so this would be where we got that function, right? So we had 10 minus 4, but no. We don't have that. We have x. Was it plus or minus? Or it was minus. And then you had minus y, and then it would equal your output, which I'll just use output. So there you go. Because normally you wouldn't do an equal sign inside of like a function. You would have it go somewhere else or something, and then it would equal like a variable or something. So you would have like variable equals this. But anyways, so you have your output, and so it'd be like anything can be whatever. Now the difference is between the middle ground, which I'm just going to call parameter, which I don't necessarily know exactly what people call it, but this is kind of like the middle ground to where maybe you would define, like in parameter, you would define x. So you'd be like, variable x equals whatever, and so you would have your and then variable y would equal whatever. Inside of soft coding, however, you would actually have, let's say, it would pull it from the data of the game, or maybe it would pull it from an assets file. So let's say you made a separate file, right? And so you have your txt right here, which is a text file. And then it would be like, oh, well, x is going to equal this value, and then y is going to equal this value. And so let's say, for example, you ended up having different configurations for frame rate, for example. You could end up having it, so I don't know what the hell this function is going to be, but let's say the output had to equal 120, for example. So it'd be like 120 FPS, and it was calculating something based on frame rate, for example. Let's say you were using a timing function. That's actually a great one, so I'll use that a little bit later. So it's like, let's say a timing function, for example. So you can end up configuring it with this configuration file that would be like 120 txt or something like that, and then it would use those variables instead. Or you can end up pulling from the game. Let's say it ends up pulling from the game itself. So let's say you got your game code, which is just a jumble of mess or whatever, and then it ends up pulling out, and it's like, oh, the game is running at 90 FPS, and then you could go in and modify these values. And this is the major difference between these three, to where hard-coded is to where it's just values. There are no variables whatsoever, and it is just put in there. Let's say there's a string, for example. You have a warning. Let's say your frame rate dips below 60 FPS, or let's say you get hit by an enemy, right? And so on a hard-coded value, let's say you ended up skipping over this. So you have a hard-coded value, and it's like, say, if get hit, I'm just going to use a basic function here or something like that, then display. This isn't actually code, but I'm just going to use it as an example. So you end up having it here, and it's like, okay, so a hard-coded value would end up having it, so it's like, oh, you were hit. You were hit. Yay! And it would display that at the top of the screen, right? Now, that doesn't sound very useful, right? Because that would kind of annoying, so it would end up showing up at the screen. But let's say there was a specific case to where, let's say it was a stealth mission in a video game. Let's say we wanted it to say different things. Like, let's say we said, oh, you were hit, or let's say you were, or actually, another one could be like display blood effect, and then dot display blood or something like that. I don't, once again, not actually, you know, a code, but this would be like stuff that would be inside the game code. So it would be like display blood. But let's say you had a shield on, right? And you didn't want to display blood. Or let's say you wanted to display a different message. This is where the other two kind of goes into play. Let's say, for example, we have parameter. And so inside the code, you would have something else. Let's say there was an option that would end up like going into it. Let's say you had a settings file, right? And so inside your settings file, you would end up having these functions or whatever. So you would end up having like, display message, right? We'll just keep it simple. I'll just abbreviate it because you know what I'm saying. And then you would be like, oh, and then you would type in whatever you wanted here. So it would be like, you didn't dodge, for example. And then you can end up, you know, changing this however you want it. Or let's say it was inside like, you know, the game code or something like that, and it would change depending on it. And this would essentially be a variable. And then when you end up going into your variables, you would actually have a variable. So you would have variable display, right? Or display X or whatever. So display message. And then you end up going into your code. So you would say get hit. I am typing this terrible or spelling this terribly, so I apologize for that. So display. And then you would end up, instead of having like a parameter or the actual what you would say there, you would have your parameter or your variable. So you would be like display X, right? And this meant that I could spell anything. And the thing about this is you could have your settings for like your default option. This would be like the soft coding one. Or maybe you have an external file that would pull what enemy hit you, for example. So it would be like, goblin, right? Goblin hit. And then it could be equal like, goblin hit you. So you would have that, and then you can end up changing it for various different ones, and you can end up pulling this data from this file, or you can end up changing it within the code itself. So you can end up being like, oh, let's go ahead and pull the enemy that we got and use a table to end up finding what that was. So it'd be like display X, right? So it'd end up, when you end up grabbing this variable, it could be like, oh, well, the aspect or the object was, again, this isn't actual code, equal to goblin. Therefore, I could change this in, and you can end up changing it so there'd be like display X, and then, you know, you can end up having your variable or whatever, goblin, et cetera, or hit you would actually be more accurate because X would be the goblin, so it'd be like hit you. Now, the benefit to this is the fact that you can end up changing this, and let's say it wasn't supposed to display blood. Again, we can end up going over here, and let's say we have a display Y. And this would be a bool, right? And so it would be a bool. Do you have a shield or do you not? And so this would end up pulling out from, let's say, the character file or something like that. So you'd have your character, and then it would be like, another function could be like has shield. Now, in a hard-coded world, you wouldn't be able to check this because there's no variables, right? You would just have this, it would display it, and it would always show blood. And you'll see a lot of terrible games that actually do this a lot too, but you'll end up having it so it's always going to display blood. So you're on your screen, you get hit by a rock, and then all of a sudden your screen is just blah, red everywhere. Actually, I can switch color. Red everywhere. Oh, that's not red, but you get what I'm saying. And so it'd be like, oh, well, you know, that shouldn't happen because I had a shield, and you have this little shield artifact on your screen. It's like, well, that doesn't make any sense. But if you end up doing this function here, you can end up being like, okay, well, we're going to pull from our other function that has the character, right? And then we're going to pull the data and see if they have a shield. And then you can end up pulling it in and be like, oh, and then when you end up going to display blood, instead you would be like bool. And then you would be like, okay, well, character has shield or whatever. So you end up having this as another variable or another if statement, has shield. And then if so, or if true, then run whatever, right? This is terrible code, and this is not code whatsoever, but then it would be like display blood or don't display blood. So if true, then don't display blood, right? So just do nothing. Or otherwise you can end up having it like a shield effect instead. So it could be like display shield. There we go. Display shield. Now, this is the major benefit to all these different types. So to kind of go over it, basically when you end up going into hard coding, you are saying this is going to happen every single time. This ends up happening no matter what. And the large downside to this is, let's say there was different enemies. So let's say it was like different enemy types, or let's say it was different frame rates, for example. You would have to retype this in every single time. So this would also be copied throughout the entire thing. So you would end up having this over and over again. So let's say you had a function up here that used it, and you had a function up here that used it, and a function over here that used it. It would be typed in every single time, or copied mostly to every single time. And that is terribly inefficient. However, let's say there was a function to where you knew your frame rate was going to be 60 every single time, right? This is where the benefit comes into play, because you are only storing one value. You're going to be storing that 60 FPS or whatever, or let's say you're a peasant, you're doing 30 or whatever. You would be storing one value. So this is where hard coding can actually be useful. Let's say you're running into memory limitations. You ended up seeing this with a lot of handheld consoles. You end up seeing it in mobile games, et cetera, to where if the value is always going to be the same, and you know it's going to be the same, let's say you're running on a PSP, for example, and it's always going to have the same exact hardware with the variations, ignoring that. Let's say it's the exact same every single time, and you knew it was going to run at 60 FPS every single time. Then you can end up using a hard-coded value just to save on performance. This is the major benefit to hard coding. The thing is, we live in a generation now to where we can run thousands and thousands and thousands of variables, millions of variables actually. Most program communications actually go through millions, if not billions, of calculations like every few seconds. And so technically speaking, this really isn't relevant, but if you have a target hardware, let's say you're working on robotics, for example, and you need a robot arm that has two variables, you can end up kind of like hard coding in how they would move depending on what you ended up wanting. Let's say there was a walking variable that you ended up wanting. You could be like, oh, well, we have it walking at one speed and it only functions in that one speed. Let's just go ahead and hard code that. And you can end up saving that. Now, that causes a problem down the line if you want to expand on that. But again, you're storing one variable, so you would only have one variable instead. But let's say you wanted to go in this route. All of a sudden, you're storing a bunch of variables. And so instead of that, you're storing 1, 2, and then obviously you have all these variables that are within your file, and you obviously have a second file that you end up storing. All of a sudden, you're storing like 50 different variables for this one single function, correct? And so you have, has shield, and this would end up being an entirely another function, which means that you would have two functions within a single function, and then all of a sudden it's calling between other functions. Now, the downside to this is, again, you are storing a lot, and it overcomplicates. And it also takes it so that it takes longer to computate. And there are certain ones, especially when you end up getting into functions. So let's say if they have a shield or whatever, these two functions here, this gets really complicated really quickly. And if you have really large functions that aren't properly programmed, this can end up taking a long period of time. And so you end up having a function, let's say in hard-coded, it take 0.001 seconds, right? And then all of a sudden, you can have it take 1.06 or 5 or whatever. I wrote 5 when I said 6. I don't know what I'm doing in life. And this adds up very, very quickly. Like, these are small numbers, but this can end up adding up very, very quickly. Let's say it's a really complex algorithm, right? And your hard-coded value takes 1.5 seconds, right? If you wanted to soft code that, this could take upwards of 5 seconds, depending on how you coded it. And so let's say it was extremely one. And so there is another benefit. Hard coding can be faster. However, that's not always the case, because I did say that it did have to copy over and over again, right? This function, once it ends up grabbing these, this is going to be 5. And then all of a sudden you go down, it's like, oh, I don't have to grab all those variables again. So then it'll be like 1 second or 1.5 seconds, just like the hard coded value, because it already has those in memory, right? But then the hard-coded one, I don't know why I did that, it's going to do this over and over again. So every single time you had to do this, it's going to do it again and again and again and again. And all of a sudden, these computations increase exponentially. And all of a sudden, you're taking 50 seconds to program this really complicated piece of code. And so that's another huge downside to hard coding. However, inside simple programs, on something that's only going to happen once or twice, let's say you use hard coded for frame rate, for example. Normally what they would end up doing is they would have this hard coded frame rate value that they would then offput into a variable that would tell the game what to run at. And then that variable would then hold still. Like, I've actually made frame rate, hacks and things like that. So let's say, for example, Phantasy Star Portable 2 was one that I have a video on. And so inside that video, I kind of explained this, but basically what it did was it took a function, it told the game to run at a specific frame rate, and then it stored a variable for that frame rate. And then, so basically when I went in to hack it, basically I just changed that variable to whatever the hell I wanted it to, and then changed all the speed variables that were hard-coded into the game that, again, would only be pulled once. They would pull every single time the frame rate had to change, which is only in cutscenes, so it has to keep changing it. But it changes it once. And so basically you would change those values, and then you would have it so that it was just there forever. And so you can end up doing hard-coded like that. But when you end up getting into it, it's definitely not efficient, but you would end up having that variable, and then that variable would then end up being stored somewhere, and then you could use that variable, and this would actually take down on these computations. And then that's where parameter programming comes into play, to where that would technically be parameter programming, but you are implementing instances of hard coding. But what is the benefit of parameter and soft coding? Everything. The fact of flexibility. Now, if I wanted to change any sort of value, let's say I wanted to go in and I wanted to add a new enemy, I would just add in a new one to this list. Let's say I wanted to add a horse for whatever reason. So I would add in a horse hit to my settings file, and then all of a sudden the horses work. And it was like, here's the display message, etc., etc. Let's say I wanted to add in new variables. I just go into my code and add in a new variable, or I go into my settings file, I go into my external source, and I just add in another variable. Like, oh, well, I want a variable of m, right? So that was the worst M I've ever drawn in my life. M equals whatever, right? And so it has so much flexibility that you can do anything that you want, and it allows you to do a lot of settings. Let's talk about a user case example. For example, let's say frame rate. You can end up having it so you could set whatever frame rate you want. You could have it set whatever resolution you wanted. You could have it set whether you wanted to the blood display. Instead of having it so that it says character has whatever, you can end up crossing that out and being like, oh, player settings display blood, for example. Let's say you wanted to, setting for gore, for example. A lot of people don't like to have gore in their games for whatever reason. But you end up having, set blood and gore, and you can have an extra one. Maybe you can end up having it either replace, or you could add it into your function. Now, of course, this gets overcomplicated, which means that you have to be a good programmer and you have to optimize it. The problem with soft and parameter coding is that if you do not optimize it and you do not securely, properly set up your variables to where variables will overlap, overlapping variables is something I'll talk about in another video when I talk about designing variables. But, it is something that you do have to pay attention to, and it does take a lot of time to program. It will take longer to program a soft program than it will a hard program that cannot be changed, because you have to talk about, all these different variables, and you're making multiple functions, and you're making multiple sets, and you have to make multiple files that it will end up importing and taking all these settings apart and stuff. But for the most part, you want to use soft and parameter coding in every single case that you can. So always end up using those if you possibly can, because if you can't, then you're going to run into problems in the future. And if you're working with a small program, it can be fine to end up doing hard coding, but it's going to be incredibly difficult to go back. And let's say somebody was modding stuff. Let's say you want to have modding support, for example. Having the hard code have to go through, the modders will have to go through and change it every single time that you have a new variable that you end up using that function in, and maybe they'll miss one. And then that ends up creating bugs. Or let's say even you go back into your code, and I've actually done this in the past with one of my mods, and I completely botched it because of it, and I had to abandon it. But I ended up hard coding a value because I was doing it very, very quickly. I didn't think I was going to expand nearly as far as I did. And then when I went back, I missed values. I missed places to where it would end up working, and then that causes bugs. And so if I would have just gone through, created a single variable for all of these instances, it would have been simple. I would have gone into that variable, changed it, checkmarked it, made sure it was right. Boom, it would have worked perfectly fine. No bugs attached. Unfortunately, I didn't do that. So that's a nice story from me to end up going through. So if you're ever wondering what hard code and soft code it is, there's an overly drawn out explanation. And yeah, so there you go. Hard coded, essentially it is values that are put into the code that cannot be changed unless you change the machine code or the hex values, etc., etc. Stuff that the computer reads, and which is incredibly complicated, and it can have a lot of bugs with it and stuff like that. And so it's a little bit annoying. Try not to hard code. It does have some advantages like we talked about, but mostly you want to go towards soft coding or the middle ground to where you're parameter coding and to where you are actually making it so that things can change your values easily, including you. So if you want to go through and make like settings and stuff like that, make sure that all your variables are set up so that that one variable is used out throughout your entire code, and then your life will become incredibly easy in comparison. It will be a little bit more complicated, and it does take more work, and it takes more knowledge, but of course, it's the best way to program, and we're all here to improve. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe for more content like this one. And of course, you can end up leaving a comment below talking about improvements. Have you actually done any coding like this? Did you know what it was? Did you not know what it is? Where is your background? Was I overcomplicated with this? I really don't do too well when I talk about code. I barely used anything. Like if I zoom out here, I barely used any of my space here. I got tons of white space. Yeah, I love this board thing, by the way. But yeah, so like, go ahead and give your programming stories, and maybe there's some stuff that I missed or some examples that are nice to talk about. Maybe there's some advantages and disadvantages. Of course, I'm just trying to do a layman's thing. I'm kind of long on this video. Apologies. I was aiming for 15 minutes and I went way over. But yeah, so make sure to leave your comments down there, and you can also subscribe for more of this. And if you're interested in my other types of projects, you can end up checking out my website at michaelpstanich.com. I'll put it right here. Yeah, I'll do that in post. I'm not writing it because my writing is terrible, as you've seen it. And then obviously, if you want to talk about video games or maybe programming and content creation, you can end up jumping into our chat box, the Discord channel, which is an open Discord. It is called The Broken Chat Box, link in the description. We end up talking about video games, we have gaming nights, etc., etc. And so, yeah, go ahead and jump in there if you're interested. And I am going to go back to programming, and I'm going to change some hard code into soft code, because I am guilty of this quite often. Even though I know the differences, I still end up hard coding things, and I don't always realize it, because I'm an artist, not a programmer. But whatever, we all live with our mistakes. I like that outro. God damn it. Oh, as a side note, to end this, this is a new microphone, by the way. Make sure to tell me how it worked.